This episode is brought to you with support from the 70 Million podcast. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 5th episode of Force of Law. This one is going to be a little different from the others we've done so far. If you've been with us since the beginning, you know we've been following 2 bills in the California legislature that are meant to reduce police shootings. Well, Governor Gavin Newsom just signed one of them into law.
I'm ready to sign this damn thing, so why don't we just cut to the chase? But I didn't know.
The governor's signature on AB 392 marks a pivot point for this podcast. All season, I've been bringing you stories about Californians whose experiences have shaped the state's debate over police use of deadly force. Today, join me for a look inside what it's been like to make this series. I'm Laurel Rosenhall, and this is Force of Law, a podcast about police shootings and California's attempt to do something about them. Before we get into that conversation, let's listen to a bit more from the bill signing ceremony in Sacramento on August 19th, 2019. Here's Assemblywoman Shirley Weber.
They always say if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. I've never met individuals more passionate and more concerned than the families who've lost individuals in this whole process. It has been an eye-opener for me, because I understood somewhat their pain, but I never knew how deep and how permanent that pain was because they lacked justice. For 400 years, people of color have often had a different kind of justice than others in this nation. And after 400 years of demonstrating our commitment and our humanity to this nation, we deserve fairness and justice. When others ask for reform in the future, you will look back and say, can it happen? Will it happen? And I hope you look at 392 and say that it can.
Here's Governor Newsom.
Let me extend particular gratitude to Dr. Shirley Weber for her faith and devotion to the cause of justice, to her tenacity, her hard work, her determination, for recognizing good enough never is. I think people all across the country are grateful to you because as California goes, so goes the rest of the United States of America. And we are doing something today that stretches the boundaries of possibility, that sends a message to people all across this country that they can do more and they can do better to meet this moment in their respective states. With gratitude, with appreciation, and with a deep sense of responsibility, in a hope that we can reduce the number of lives lost and we can begin to build trust and heal. I'm honored now to sign this legislation and I'm gratified. That is mine. 392 is now law in the state of California. Dr. Weber.
This is Cephas Johnson, who started advocating for police reforms a decade ago after an officer shot his nephew, Oscar Grant.
I'm extremely happy. This work has just really begun when legislation actually becomes law. The battle is not over. We'll still be in this, and we'll do what we can to help make sure that the cultures change.
This is a quick break to tell you about another criminal justice podcast called 70 Million. It examines reforms cities and states are trying, like eliminating cash bail and overturning wrongful convictions. One episode focuses on a program in California that's trying to keep foster youth out of jail. And the podcast is open source, so it's great for teachers, organizers, and community media makers because it means you can use and share all the original resources on the 70 Million website for free. 70 Million is produced by Lantigua Williams and Company and funded by the MacArthur Foundation's Safety and Justice Challenge. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. I got together recently with the team behind Force of Law to reflect on what we've learned reporting this series and to preview what we have in store for the rest of the season. Here's our conversation.
I'm Joaquin Alvarado, one of the executive producers. So these are deep, long issues, not breaking news, which people are used to dealing with, especially with police shootings. It's like, there's the next one. Is there cell phone footage? How bad was it? You know, and then sometime later, the police usually are exonerated. But this one it's tactile in this community because of Stephon Clark. So is that part of the reason why you guys felt like a podcast would give you a way in, and why this issue?
Before this bill was even introduced, we were having conversations about, like, could you do a narrative series about, basically about how a bill becomes a law, but not the Schoolhouse Rock version, the very kind of like real life version.
I'm David Lesher, editor of CalMatters, one of the executive producers. We thought of a podcast because, the mission of CalMatters is to help people understand, the policies in California and how the process works. So, we thought anybody who's covered the Capitol for a long time has been in hearings where there's as much drama as a reality TV show, where, you have two sides that have high stakes, high emotions. We did have those wow moments in the hearing then when things changed and there was gasps in the audience. And to kind of bring that process to life in a kind of storytelling way like podcasts lend them to, we thought it would be a way not just to tell a good story, but also to help understand how the process works, to see legislators in action and trying to decide between interest groups with all the stakes involved.
I think it's been really cool to experiment with this platform, and I do think that it's you reach a different audience. So there's people who listen to the podcast who don't normally read what we write, and vice versa. I do think one thing that's been interesting is trying to make a narrative with this story and also cover something more or less in real time. Normally, when you craft a storyline, you kind of know where you're going. And we set out to do this project without knowing where the end was, and trying to put out episodes once a month so that we could capture some of the activity that was ongoing more or less while it was happening, not exactly on a breaking news pace, but still to kind of keep people engaged with what the legislature was currently up to. And so that definitely presents challenges. But then when I think of the alternative would have been, well, we could have just been reporting on it all year, and then we could sit down and put, a series together of episodes. I feel like we would lose the ability to engage people when something is really happening. The stories that people are telling are really emotional, personal, intimate, and they lend themselves to this audio format because you can hear people's voices, their emotions. I mean, even I got comments from some listeners about hearing the panting breath of the officers kind of on the body cam footage. It's like you really kind of can bring something into podcasting that's very different than what you write on the page.
I guess it was a little surprising for me just how acute the Clark shooting seemed to be and how it kept going in terms of the community's response and just the dynamics around it. It felt particularly poignant for you guys as a newsroom based here and us collaborating on this podcast to, have that as one of the anchor stories.
Well, I think the Stephon Clark shooting is really one of the quintessential social media videotaped kind of experiences that has driven this issue nationally. One of the things the city did was put out the video immediately, and the video was shocking. You saw somebody get killed.
I think it's interesting how that tragedy became the catalyst for this policy debate that we're following, because what I've learned in reporting this story is that the ACLU had actually been trying to get a bill like this introduced for years. And what they've told me was like there wasn't even a legislator who would touch it. But then when Stephon Clark was killed, you had a bunch of people here who were very upset about it. So it became the catalyst for this bill, even though this is an issue that civil rights advocates have been wanting to introduce for a while.
Does it make a difference to a state elected official to have community members show up at the Capitol?
I think it makes a big difference. One of the things about this podcast in particular that was so compelling is that this is an issue that two sides can look at the exact same video and see totally different things. And when we had Laurie Valdez look at the video for the first time of Antonio Lopez, her partner, being killed, and what she saw, this man that she loved and a family man, and then to know that video had been used through the whole legal process and the police officer has been exonerated, it just to have an issue that is that divided in impressions, and then you've got a regulatory process that has to figure out how to bring these sides together.
I'm Cheryl Duvall, editor of Force of Law. The phenomenon of various people looking at the same video and reaching really different conclusions is not new. And certain things about the Stephon Clark case took me right back to the Rodney King beating, in which so many people saw clear police misconduct and use of extreme force, and yet the 4 Los Angeles cops were acquitted. In crafting this podcast, I felt it was really important to represent many sides, as you, Laurel, and Brian strove to do in a really thorough way, but also to explain the many points of view around police use of deadly force in ways that would make sense to listeners who maybe have never had an encounter with police, or who are really wary of police, as I myself sometimes am, or aren't steeped in the law, in lobbying, in policy. And that's where some of the most dramatic and compelling moments of the podcast came across to me, because it helped people understand that this is a process created by human beings, flawed, hopeful, disappointing, subject to compromise.
When you go take on that assignment, what are you asking reporters to do? Because to really understand it, you've got to get into the questions around trauma and how people deal with trauma. And you mentioned the Laurie Valdez situation. I mean, it was kind of astounding to have, you and Brian in the room with her as she's seeing this footage for the first time. What was that like?
This has definitely been an emotionally difficult story to report, this whole entire series. I think the same reasons that make it, compelling are also the same things that make it so difficult, because people are deeply traumatized on both sides of this issue. The people who are in mourning, their grief and their anguish is real. And so they want to share their stories from a place of almost kind of a therapeutic venting kind of place. And I think for a lot of them, it also feels like talking about their loved one is a way of seeking justice. It's very different from the type of reporting that I typically do in the Capitol, which is much less emotional, right? I can have a distance from it because it's a political fight. It's a policy fight. There's not as much heart and soul in it. So that's been hard, to be that close to the trauma.
Brian, I think you were on the way back from the Valdez trip. And I think, Brian, you said to me that was really rough, and then there was like this long pause. Being in that kind of situation, what's that like?
I'm Brian Howie, producer of Force of Law. It's pretty rough. You have the initial situation of sitting across the table from a woman who's watching her partner be shot to death for the first time, and seeing her face crumple like a tin can and wailing, and listening to that and knowing you're going to have to go back home and listen to it again to pick out the audio that's going to be used for the show. And then you're just constantly wading through people's grief. And then, like Laurel said, you're bouncing from side to side. It really wears you down after a while.
On the police side of things, I feel like there's not as much demonstration of emotion, But there is also an enormous sense of we could die, we could get hurt, we could be killed. We're out here trying to take care of innocent people and we're under attack. You know, there's much more of a projection of strength and no, they don't want to seem vulnerable, but I think there is still a lot of trauma on that side.
What strikes me about these videos and stories like Stephon Clark or Antonio Guzman Lopez is the feeling of, again, if anything, the recurrence of this kind of police violence has lost its shock value, has polarized people in ways I couldn't have imagined. It's either something that really gets your gut or something else to ignore, like, I'm sorry to say, the latest mass shooting.
I think that the biggest learning moment for me, the biggest kind of aha of this entire project came in talking to this professor at UC Berkeley who said that the nut issue of this whole thing is the amount of guns we have in our society. We have chosen to be a culture that embraces civilian gun ownership, and because so many Americans have guns, it means that when police show up for a call, they could face someone who is armed on any call, even the most routine call for help. And because of that, they are ready to fire their weapons.
One of the things I suspect we'll talk about more in the podcast is whether this law will make any real difference in the rate at which law enforcement in California uses deadly force.
We've tried asking that question and no one's willing to kind of commit to, well, we're going to reduce it by 10% or we're going to see this many, fewer. I mean,
what would 10% equal? 10% less police shootings
would be like maybe around 15 fewer per year in California only.
And just on its face, would 10% reduction in police killings feel like impact?
It would to those 15.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's not insignificant. I think that, again, the statistics in California are that most of the people who police kill are armed. And I don't think this law is going to make any difference in those cases.
Right.
Or at least not in the vast majority of them.
Does Shirley Weber think that this is a cure-all?
I don't think she does. She's someone who comes out of the civil rights movement, and I think she knows that you don't make one change and expect that that's it. But I wouldn't be surprised if in the upcoming years she's still working on this issue writ large. In this case, in order to reach a deal that the police would agree not to oppose and the civil rights groups still backed, you lost the support of some people on the margins, including Black Lives Matter withdrew its support for the bill. In the end, they felt like the bill was too weak and they didn't support it. I asked Shirley Weber, how she felt about losing the support of Black Lives Matter, since obviously this is the whole idea for this bill kind of grew out of that movement. And she said, I understand it. And she said, I'm thrilled that we kept all the supporters we kept. When you take on something this controversial and you struggle to reach a compromise, you're always going to lose some supporters. And I'm just glad that we kept all the groups that maintained their support, that we kept all of them and we only lost a few supporters.
You guys have ended up having as a source Oscar Grant's uncle. What was that like to sort of be interviewing Uncle Bobby? How does he reflect on that sort of delivery of justice, and what was his perspective on sort of how the bill has evolved, and what does he think about it?
Uncle Bobby has stayed with AB 392. He stayed pretty positive throughout the process. You're not going to attain cultural shift with a single bill. But in the end, he sees it as the stepping stone that it is.
He has a pretty nuanced view about compromise from my conversations with him, and he just says that's part of the political process. And to me, that seems unusual among activists because, and frankly, in our society at large right now, we are in a moment where compromise is not a good word for most people, right? Like they just want their side to win. My analysis of this situation was there really was compromising. Both sides did not get exactly what they wanted, and both sides got some of what they wanted. And I think this bill is not as strong as it set out to be, and it's not as harmful to the police as they feared it would be.
Is it possible that the state is not the only potential actor in this? I mean, why can't a city just say, look, if you're a police and you're involved in a shooting, we're going to have independent investigators, and if we find that it wasn't justified, you're fired?
Well, my understanding is that, there are already cities that have policies like this one that California is adopting. So what is unusual here is that it is happening at a statewide level.
Which city is done?
Well, San Francisco's done something similar, and Seattle's done something similar. And we're hoping to, explore that in a future episode because we want to look and see what difference it's made. Seattle, I'm looking forward to doing more reporting on it, but they had several years ago, the federal Department of Justice came in and they were sort of required to do a bunch of changes in their police department. And because it was done through the Department of Justice, there's been this long ongoing evaluation process. And so there is a long record that we can explore of what changes it's made.
Could the governor have been stronger or different in this process?
The governor wanted the legislature to pass something, and his office was involved in negotiating this compromise. I don't think he would have signed something that the police were actively opposing. I don't think the legislature would have passed something the police were actively opposing. So I think the political necessity was to get to the point where the police would say, okay, we can live with it.
San Diego has a program where they try to get mental health professionals to the scenes of these things with law enforcement so that there's some chance to kind of mitigate it because there's often a mental health, situation happening. Do you see that as being sort of the next wave of like this bill happens this year and then next year we try to deal with both the mental health leading up to these things happening and then what happens after?
The bill that the police officers got behind definitely talks about more training for officers on being aware of mental illness in the people that they interface with, and training them to sort of try to help calm people down. I know there is a movement among some of the officers' unions that want to kind of have more experts deployed with them when they go deal with these extreme cases. And that is something we're looking at for an upcoming episode that is going to be specifically looking at the responsibility that law enforcement has to help people who are in a crisis. So that's something we'll be exploring more very soon. We'll be back soon with an episode about how mental illness factors into police shootings. Please subscribe to Force of Law so you get it in your feed as soon as it's released. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please review us on Apple Podcasts. It really helps spread the word. You're listening to Force of Law, a production of CalMatters and Studio To Be. I'm your host, Laurel Rosenhall. Brian Howie is our producer. Cheryl Duvall is our editor. David Lesher of CalMatters and Joaquin Alvarado and Kristen Belden of Studio To Be are the executive producers. Thanks also to Zach Moreno of Squadcast and Chloe Behrens.